Thanks so much, Paul. So I'm going to chat to Ben. I was MD of The Sun, fascinating title. I've gone through quite big changes over recent years. Ben's been in post for 2 years now, I think.
This one.
We've known each other for quite a long time, but we're going to talk about how The Sun is changing. And I think The Sun, everyone in this room knows The Sun is a quintessentially British brand, but it's changing. So let's find out. First of all, I guess the theme of this year is Riders on the Storm. So how have you and how's The Sun ridden the storm over the last couple of years?
Well, I certainly think the theme of the conference is very relevant for publishing as a whole. You know, there have been so many storms that we've faced over the past few years. There's the continued decline of print, and that isn't going to change. We've seen huge changes in the way that platforms deal with content, the way they value content. We've, of course, seen the evolution of the programmatic marketplace, and so many publishers, The Sun included, very reliant on that as a stream of revenue, and in particular the way that advertisers value, or in some cases don't value, the importance of context. So that's had a big impact. And of course, the macroeconomic challenges we've seen in the last year, 18 months in particular. And for The Sun, you know, as you rightly say, the heritage, the history is a unique asset, but that can also present a challenge at times as well. So, the big challenge for The Sun has been changing from being a newspaper to being a multi-platform digital news and entertainment brand. And that's been a difficult journey, but we've made some really good strides in the last few years. I think, in particular, we've built our audience. So we started this in really 2016. And before that, The Sun was behind a paywall. And retrospectively, we wouldn't have done that, but we learnt a lot from it. We did it. 2016, that changed. Since then, we've built a digital audience in the UK of nearly 30 million. Significant part of that audience, so a quarter, is under 34, which makes us quite, purely on that audience, quite a large youth publisher almost in its own right. But of course, we're not that per se. So we've developed that audience. We've focused on building communities and changing the type of content that we would write about. So, in particular areas such as fashion, beauty, technology, been very successful, money. So really focusing on building online communities around those areas. International growth has been a huge area for us, and I'm sure we'll come on to that, in particular the US. And finally, thinking about the way we distribute content means that video takes a much bigger role. So adapting the stories that we publish for a multi-platform environment, which is increasingly video-led.
So it's a huge audience, and I find it quite interesting that such a large proportion haven't picked up a paper, whereas for me, The Sun's always been a newspaper brand first, but I'm very old. But this move to The Sun becoming a digital platform, digital multi-platform brand, I guess, how's that changed The Sun's overall proposition, and what role has data played within that?
You're absolutely right. The majority of the audience have never picked up a copy of the Sun newspaper. And so that's a big change. We wouldn't have imagined that a few years ago. But the digital-only audience now vastly outweighs the print audience. And we think about how we grow that audience by looking at off-platform environments and balancing off and on-platform environments. So assessing each of the off-platform distribution channels and thinking about how do we make our content available there, and then bring people back to our own platforms where hopefully we can engage them and make them want to come back for more. And to your point, data plays a huge role in that. So as we began this digital evolution, really, or the second phase of it in 2016, towards the end of that year, we started to join together all of the data sets that we'd created, and some of them had existed for decades. Think about Dream Team, for instance, fantasy football, where people would send in their data in the post and fill out slips to do substitutions. So we amalgamated all of that with other News UK properties, so the Times and the Wireless properties, for instance, and we created a data platform called Nucleus, a first-party data platform, which understands the preferences, opinions, and emotions of all of those audiences. And it means we can use it from an advertising perspective, so we can understand how to reach people in the right moment, measure that impact, and then consider how to do it better next time, knowing what we know from that engagement. But we also really use it ourselves, and that's where it's had really significant effect on our proposition. So one such example is personalization, and we just think there's a lot of scope for publishers to get better at customizing the experience and making it more relevant. And so we became obsessed a few years ago about sending people away from our site via content recommendation. You see so many publishers do this. You cut the bottom half of the page off and surrender that in terms for a revenue guarantee. And sometimes that used to make sense, and we did it, but we didn't like it for two reasons. Firstly, we were losing control of the page, the user experience, the advertiser experience. And secondly, the most engaged audience, the people who have read the article all the way to the bottom, their reward was being sent somewhere else, which was typically a really poor quality experience, like a made-for-advertising site. And that didn't seem like the right reward for being our most loyal readers. So we built a personalization capability using that nucleus data, using a variety of in-house capabilities. Our data science team wrote AI models, and then we put interchangeable tiles at the bottom of the page. And it just had a really transformative impact. So we doubled the revenue from that part of the page, but crucially, we increased the recirculation to our own stories by 40%. So more people were clicking on stories because they were relevant and they were staying within our brand. And you know, it made a really big impact. But you talk about riding the storm. We've seen one of the biggest impacts that publishers have felt in the last year, 18 months, has been a downturn in the programmatic market, which I mentioned. It's been well publicized. It's happened here in the US. It's a global thing and clearly tied to the macroeconomic challenges. And the natural reaction to that for many publishers was to put more on. You know, let's chase this money. Let's put more ads, more things that you do. And you probably can think of that or recognize some sites where you've seen over the last 18 months or so, it's become actually hard to read. There's just more and more being added, chasing the money that was lost. And what this data-driven approach allowed us to do was go the other way and start taking things off and trying to be more targeted, more relevant, and give people a better experience. So, you know, we're not immune to these programmatic storms, but it certainly helps us mitigate them.
Okay, so let's talk about this data understanding your audience to be able to deliver a more powerful, I guess, experience just for readers, and advertisers. How does that translate to the US, which you mentioned, especially because the Sun is the most British brand I can think of. So how does that translate to the US?
Yeah, so we launched the US in January of 2020, and if you think back to January of 2020, it was a lot going on in the world, but there was also, in the US, it was the election year, and a particularly toxic election year. And we were very lucky that News Corp, our parent company, didn't tell us we had to take a political stance. So it was a blank canvas, and we could create the product that we wanted to create. So that meant we could avoid the toxicity of that presidential election. We knew that hard news was a very competitive space in the US. So we covered it, but not as you may imagine, and we focused more on lifestyle content, consumer content. Money, for instance, did very well that year. So we built the audience by starting with Google and Facebook. We work with some aggregators, and we do that still to this day. So, for example, we're pre-installed on handsets. And we did target a female audience to start with, and purely because females have a higher propensity to share stories on social media, so we thought that was a good place to start. And so the audience is 60% female, who account for about 70% of the page views. But since then, we've built a really, a significant editorial operation, and that's now writing content across a much broader variety of topics, and the distribution, the demographic and age distribution now is spread across the entire population, just as we do in the UK. But, you know, I think to your point about the Britishness thing, what we tried to do was to take what's unique about the Sun, its irreverent tone and its wit, the best elements of the Sun, and apply that to US content. So by hiring journalists in the US and taking that was what made it successful, rather than the Britishness per se. And I think the success shows that the US market was ready for a tabloid in the mold of the Sun. And we think there's plenty of growth there still to be had.
And you mentioned irreverence, and yes, that's what the Sun is known for. The Sun also is known for having very strong opinions. And opinions in this world we live in now, in a social media-driven world, can be a blessing or a curse. And it can be a very odd place sometimes for brands to exist in. Yeah. With the strength of opinion. So with the Sun, I mean, you built your brand with the strength of your opinion. Are they a blessing or a curse when it comes to the world we live in today? Well,
I think right now it's important to be, as a publisher, to have an opinion. As you say, it's always been part of the Sun's ethos, to stand out, to provoke conversation. And I don't think we'd change that. And in particular, we wouldn't change it right now. And I can see with the advent of AI producing a lot more content that there is going to be content out there which is increasingly bland, which is increasingly uniform, and that's not what we want to be. We want to be a catalyst for conversation, and we want to at times, I suppose, court controversy and be opinionated. Now, of course, sometimes, as you point out, it can be a curse because sometimes we'll get that wrong. And there's a very high-profile case in the last year, which was the Clarkson piece that he wrote in December, which clearly, that was a big mistake. And there are times when humans will make mistakes, but I think we would always rather have that human touch, take those risks. When we do make the mistakes, we need to apologize and move on from them and learn from those mistakes. But on balance, I think being opinionated is important and being distinctive. And I also think on that there's a role for that in advertising as well. And we conducted some research a few years ago now, but it was with the London School of Economics and Professor Paul Dolan, who's a behavioural scientist, and it showed about the correlation between emotion and advertising placed in the context of that emotion. So when there is an emotional correlation between the article and the advertising message, that the engagement increases significantly. And the same when an article is emotionally stimulating, that people take more note of the advertising within it, and that's rooted in behavioural science. So I think those advertisers that are willing to appear alongside opinion and distinctive content are going to reap rewards from doing so. But with that, we certainly understand that there's a brand safety, brand suitability concern, and so it's really incumbent on us as a publisher to create the tools and to be able to understand the semantics and be able to make sure that we can offer those guarantees that advertisers are going to be presented in a suitable environment. And if that means avoiding opinion, then then so be that.
How have you navigated those waters, especially around things like brand safety, especially given the overall sort of macro movement to a recognition nowadays of the importance of quality premium media, the importance of advertisers being in environments such as The Sun, where you're in with a premium brand. But also there are issues around brand safety, as we know. How have you navigated those waters to ensure advertisers feel safe and happy within the walls of The Sun?
Well, it's different for every advertiser, I think. That's the first thing we need to recognise. To the extent that we can have a conversation with an advertiser and show that we can understand the concerns that an advertiser has and customise the response to each individual advertiser. And when we work directly with customers, that's what we do. So we'll tag every article at an editorial level, so we'll apply our own tagging. Brand safety in news is always an issue. You layer on opinion, that's another added complexity. So some of the sort of articles that we know are not going to be brand safe, the editorial team will block ads at the outset. Okay. So, for example, something like terrorism. Yeah. But where it's more nuanced, it will be case by case, and then we'll just have those conversations. At the start, I think the technology and our own and publishers generally attempts at understanding this have come on leaps and bounds in the last 3-4 years. But I would always say, speaking directly to a publisher, those concerns are addressed.
So look, you've achieved a huge amount in your 2 years in post. But what's the future for The Sun? You've launched in the US. You've moved, I guess, successfully to create a digital brand. But what's the future hold?
So I think international expansion, as I say, we've had that success in the US, and I think we will continue to expand, particularly in English-speaking markets. I think that goes without saying. There is an opportunity potentially outside of English-speaking markets, and we'll look at that. We'll continue to look at new platforms. Video, I think, will play a big part of it. Get more sophisticated with data. Keep thinking about the experimentation we can do with the data we have at our disposal, and thinking about different ways to customize the experience, to collect more data from our readers, to bring them into the conversation. But ultimately, I think the future. The newsroom is changing, and newsrooms are changing to better reflect the audiences they serve. And Victoria Newton became, since she's become editor, she's written about a lot of things that you perhaps wouldn't, or many people wouldn't necessarily associate with The Sun. I think the content she's done on covering gender and race equality. She's done a lot about encouraging people to be more environmentally conscious and putting that in the Sun tone of voice. I think she's been very active in terms of trying to put make The Sun a force for good, and things like Who Cares Wins, which is now coming up into its, it's been a big spectacle on TV for the last few years, celebrating the good that people do in society, and in particular the emergency services. So things like that have been a big change. But ultimately we are more reflective of the society we serve. And in the US, we've done that by building the newsroom up over 3 years. And so the newsroom is a majority female newsroom that looks like its audience. And what Natalie, the editor, does there incredibly well is when she'll do a Christmas speech, for instance, she'll broadcast it on social media and invite people into that discussion and try and get people to comment and be a part of it. So we want to continue building communities in that fashion. And also for the UK, it's slightly different because it's an evolution. So we need to think about how we bring people in who are not from traditional journalistic backgrounds to better represent the audience that they serve. So we're doing paid Kickstarter and apprentice programs to bring new people into journalism and to again, hopefully change the profile of the newsroom. This one has existed for 60 years, and it's not a case of changing it as quickly as, it's more complex than the US, but changing the profile to represent the audience we serve. And that's what The Sun is. It's always been the voice of its readers, so we want to continue to be that. But naturally that voice is changing. So retain the irreverence, the character, and evolve it for the future.
That's a lovely way in which to end. So, the most inspirational man in UK publishing, Ben Walmsley, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Good luck.